On the onset of 1863, it was a matter of question of why the United States Union forces, who had a numeric advantage, a resource advantage, transportation advantage, weaponry advantage, all kinds of different advantages, larger population, um, all kinds of resources, monetary. Why weren't they winning the war? That was a massive question that was asked upon Union leadership. Large part was you have to give credit to the Confederates for fighting for their cause. But it became obvious that in order for this war to end, there was going to have to be attrition based warfare. The United States had a massive advantage over the Confederacy from a resource and population standpoint. The Confederacy had arguably better leadership and better organization. But it was going to become clear that in order for the Confederacy to maintain and eventually perhaps win, they were going to have to keep up from a resource standpoint. And they just did not have the capacity. So, what you're going to see in the American Civil War, really beginning in 1863, is a process by which the United States Union forces and federal troops would begin to outlast the Confederacy in a war of attrition, a war of resources. You're going to outlast the Confederacy because you can. Otherwise, they're going to frustrate you, especially on the Eastern Front. The Confederates, they've got their stuff together. But 1863 would become a vital year of decision as far as the long term outcome of the American Civil War. So, out west, the Union forces had seized control of New Orleans. Eventually, they would sack the town of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River in Mississippi and make their way on up other places and seize total control, thereby splitting the Confederacy virtually in two. So Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, who were Confederate states, would be completely separated now from the other Confederate states back east, like Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia. It's hard to win a war when your country is split in half. So the Union Army succeeded in doing just that. They were able to capture various different places all across Louisiana and up in Mississippi and otherwise. While Vicksburg was going down, Robert E. Lee held his armies in Virginia. And he wanted to make a point. He saw that Confederate troops out west were having very difficult times. Of course, they, had New Orleans seized and otherwise. In an effort to divert Union troops from the Western Front, instead of perhaps maybe attacking Washington, D.C. itself, Robert E. Lee decides that he's going to go up into Pennsylvania from Virginia. So he's going to cross into Maryland via the Shenandoah Valley from Northern Virginia up into Pennsylvania to draw Union troops away from other successful areas. He's going to divert them. And if the Confederate troops could engage in a major battle in Union territory and win, that not only might convince Britain and France to come to the Confederacy's aid and join the war, it might also break the morale of the Union troops in the first place. That was his strategy. If the Confederates could go up into the north and take a major battle, they effectively might make the Union quit the war effort, therefore establishing the Confederacy and the surrender of the war. That was Robert E. Lee's mindset at the time. Not a bad strategy, kind of in Sun Tzu Go format, you divert attention away. Otherwise, though, you got to kind of wonder if Robert E. Lee had a successful army in Virginia, it's closer to Washington, D.C. than it is to the southern valleys of south central Pennsylvania, like Gettysburg. Why didn't Robert E. Lee perhaps attack Washington, D.C. itself and maybe perhaps make a statement? You really want to end the war? Why don't you take the United States Capitol and hold siege, force their hand? Result wouldn't have been any different had you lost it. So, I don't know. That was one of the mistakes that Robert E. Lee made. And he didn't make a whole lot. He was very successful. But otherwise, though, um, Robert E. Lee would bring his major force up from the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia up into southern Pennsylvania near the town of Gettysburg. And in early July 1863 that year, Robert E. Lee's Confederate force met a major Union force that would be the most celebrated battle of the American Civil War, Gettysburg. So you have basically 15,000 or so Union troops meeting that many Confederate troops or whatnot. Over the course of the next few days, the Union Army is able to beat back Confederate forces, and they're able to win. And they partially cripple much of the Confederate forces at Gettysburg. And that kind of threatens everything else the Confederacy has done on the Eastern Front. The Confederacy had done no worse than encourage a stalemate in the East. Now they lost Gettysburg. And it basically split the Confederate Army and decimated it to an extent. That's really going to force the Confederates' hand. Now you've lost. You put all your cards on the table and you took a pretty big loss. He lost nearly a third of his entire army, Robert E. Lee did, as a result of Gettysburg. So, Lee withdrew from Gettysburg as a result of that battle. They wouldn't go back into Union territory. Gettysburg is the major turning point in the war. The East, which had been a large stalemate, would now begin to crumble for Confederates as they had suffered staggering losses that they couldn't quite replace from a resource standpoint. Of course, they had lost the Western Front, so any opportunity to seriously threaten Northern Territory is now going to go by the wayside. So, later on, a few months later, Abraham Lincoln itself would visit the site of Gettysburg and give his famous Gettysburg Address that would basically render dedication unto the occasion there at Gettysburg. Okay. By 1864 and 1865, that war of attrition that the Union had engaged was starting to rear its head. The South suffered a massive loss at Gettysburg. From a resource standpoint, it was going to be very difficult for them to catch back up after that. And even though the Union had a lack of true leadership, especially in the East, they still had a resource advantage standpoint. And a former Western Army General, William Tecumseh Sherman, was appointed by Abraham Lincoln to make an eastward advance, starting from modern-day Chattanooga, Tennessee. And from that standpoint, Tecumseh Sherman's idea was to take Atlanta from Chattanooga, Tennessee, make his way down to the Georgia coast and back up into the Carolinas. And Tecumseh Sherman was largely successful in sacking Georgia. Part of the reason why is he had a large Union force that would eventually surround and take Atlanta. And he burned Atlanta to the ground. That's a demoralizing feat. If you're a Confederate sympathizer or otherwise a Confederate Army troop or anything else of the sort, Atlanta gets burned to the ground. To make things worse, Tecumseh Sherman begins his march to the sea from Atlanta to the Georgia coast. From Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, Tecumseh Sherman takes about a 60-mile swath all the way to the coast, and he destroys everything along the way. He burns every single town along that march to the sea down to the ground. He burns all their crops. He takes only necessary supplies with him. They live off the land for that particular time. And he debilitates Georgia. The South had been struggling in the first place. They could hardly replenish themselves. And so when Union troops would blockade a town, the townspeople would starve. You force their hand. You force the people against the war effort. You burn down their town. You take away all their food. You starve them. That was Tecumseh Sherman's philosophy, and it was very largely successful. So when he reached Savannah, Georgia, and burned that to the ground, he made a beeline back up into the Carolinas. And as such, he would eventually make his way on up to North Carolina from Savannah, Georgia, continuing that swath of burning and decimation. So by the spring of 1865, the South had been cut off. They were starving. They were unable to replenish their numbers. They were seeing their towns get burned to the ground by Union forces. And they were in dire straits. The once successful Eastern Front had now crumbled. By April of 1865, the inevitable was even more inevitable. And eventually, that month, Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia would meet with U.S. Commander Ulysses S. Grant and offer a formal surrender of Confederate forces, thereby ending the American Civil War. The bloodiest war in American history, the bloodiest war in modern world history, is now over. So there were pockets of resistance, Southern diehards and others that would resist insurgencies, if you will. But otherwise, though, this war is over. And in doing so, it ensured the permanence of the Union. These are these United States. Yeah, the former Confederate States of America, that was only in name. You're now back to the United States. So, the question is, now what? What happens next in American history? The slavery question would now be addressed. And as I mentioned earlier, the 13th Amendment was signed and ratified in January of 1865, thereby ending slavery altogether. But Abraham Lincoln was not anti-Southern. Far from it. He supported a war that directly wanted to maintain it as part of the Union. He didn't want to anger the South any more than it was. He wanted them back into the country. So now what? What happens next? Otherwise, though, the legacy of the American Civil War as the bloodiest in modern world history, the bloodiest in American history, the advanced weaponry, the reasons why they were fought, the leadership failures and successes, the two fronts, Sherman's march to the sea, all kinds of things going on. The American Civil War's legacy, to this day, is a subtle reminder of divisions within our country that can be overcome. We think about modern times and how Americans seem very divided from a political standpoint. Division's not new in American history. Since our colonial days, people have had different ideas and expectations. A commercial economy, semi-subsistent economy, rural versus agrarian. You have all kinds of different differences. None were greater than the differences that caused the bloodiest conflict in American history, the American Civil War. We can overcome differences. And if there's any one thing that can help us overcome difference, it's perhaps this pandemic that we're undergoing right now. Having lived in a time of the post September 11th era, September 11th, 2001 was just an awful, awful day. But one of the things that I really, really saw as a silver lining in the aftermath of 9/11 was just how the country unified. Didn't matter if you were Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, black, white, Hispanic, male, female, whatever. None of that mattered. You were an American post 9/11. September 11, 2001 was an awful day. But September 12th, I like that America. It was one America. We can regain those times. This pandemic that we're undergoing doesn't know anything about race or gender, economic status. It just knows it needs a host. Everyone is an equal host. We are all in this together. And together, we can overcome. That's how Americans do it. And our history definitely suggests that.